Welcome everyone to this new episode of The Lockdown, where I explore fascinating thinkers in lockdown. Today I'm joined by Professor Barbara Kellerman, who is a professor of public leadership at the Kennedy School of Politics at Harvard University. Hello, Barbara, how are you?
Hello, Thomas. Given everything, I'm great. Given everything.
Yeah, there is apparently quite a lot going on in the world, and we probably can only scratch the surface. The first question I always ask my guests and friends is how the lockdown experience has been going for them and what they learned about themselves and the state of humanity. So this is a small question for you to begin.
Well, I'm very bad about myself, but I'm very good about the state of humanity. Well, about myself, I used the period, we're now talking just before Thanksgiving 2020, and let's say the lockdown began in early mid-March. I used the period to write another book. As you know, Thomas, I write a lot of books about leadership and followership and the leadership system, everything with the word leadership in it. And this one is, I call it my pandemic book. It was about grounded in the United States of America. It's called The Enablers, How Team Trump Flunked the Pandemic and Failed America. Trump is in the book, obviously, rather at the center, but the book is not about him. It's about all of his followers, ranging from his base to his family, including, Jared Kushner types. So I use the pandemic to write a book about followership, if you will, leadership/followership. As to the state of humanity, I'll take the question seriously and tell you it is my experience. I've lived long enough that when something big happens globally, maybe even domestically, we won't know until 3 to 5 years out what the impact of the pandemic has been. Everybody's already talking about all the changes that will be in consequence of the pandemic. I'm sure some will persist. I suspect others will not. So, hate to be so trite, but time will tell.
Obviously, it isn't the first time that the whole world is interested in leadership or more interested in public leadership and political leadership than they normally are. I'm sure this has happened through various periods of time. How do you cope with people who don't know anything about the subject from a technical matter, having strong opinions and views? Do you try to ignore and avoid, or do you just get caught do you react and jump onto the debate?
Well, again, speaking domestically, as you well know, Thomas, the Trump era has been especially divisive. We don't have to reiterate, friends have broken up, families have broken up, they don't talk to each other, whatever, because passions particularly around this single individual. I usually am interested, as I said, in the system, but it is also true that occasionally, and I just finished another book called Leaders Who Lust, where I talk about single leaders who are so remarkable, so impassioned, so driven, so insatiable, that they make an impact. And Donald Trump was such a person. Even the people who loathed him could not stop talking about him. We have been obsessed with this man. So it's been difficult to talk about reconciliation. Joe Biden comes along and says we're all the same and we're all American and so forth. But in a world that tends, driven partly, of course, by technology, that tends to be increasingly at the extremes rather than the center, it becomes quite hard. So when I don't try ever to convince people, but of course I have my own views. And with regard to certain individuals, someone in my position is obliged to make value judgments. So we do, some of us.
So let's talk a little bit about technology, and I will ask you about the two books you mentioned, which are your latest two, in a minute. But when technology started, a lot of people thought, with the kind of Arab Spring and Twitter kind of mobilizing the masses, that it will be a force for democracy and have, make the world freer, etc. And it seems like it has actually caused, or at least after that came a rise in autocratic leadership or populism. Do you think the two are related?
Yes, and yes. And as I always tell my students or my audiences, Thomas, when you're doing leadership work and you're thinking about it more than superficially, it is important to have the capacity to keep two apparently contradictory ideas in your head at the same time. And you just came up with a perfect example. You're right about the romance of the Arab Spring and that particular period. And we could go back. We could go back, for example, to the fall of the wall, the collapse of communism, the rights revolutions in the United States, civil rights and women's rights and disability rights and animal rights and gay and lesbian rights. So we can go back and say about those moments that they were changing, and we thought they would change in huge ways. We thought they would be changes overnight. Usually that does not happen, which does not, however, mean that there aren't changes. And you're quite right to say, and I say this a lot, I write this a lot, the push toward democracy, that it was around 2011, 2012, was real. We see it, for example, in the Me Too movement or the Black Lives Matter. That's real. But at the same time, as you just said, there was a kind of counter-revolution. So we have, if you look at the Freedom House ratings, you will see that in the last 10 years, the number of liberal democracies, countries that are liberal democracies, has declined, while the number of autocracies has increased. So they're both true at the same time. History is not neat. Leadership and followership are not neat. It is important, as I said, to be complex. It doesn't mean it's complicated. It just means you have to be a little bit nuanced. And again, in this case, technology, which has had an incredibly important impact on the dynamic between leaders and followers. But you can't just say it is either this or this. It is several things at the same time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, let's talk about leaders who lust. How do you define lust, and how do we know whether a leader is lusting or a leader who lusts?
Well, first of all, the word, which makes some people crazy, but the subtitle of this particular book is Power, Money, Sex, Success, Legitimacy, and Legacy. So the word
no
lust,
no rock and roll, because I guess
that's the next book. You forgot it's the next book.
Okay.
So very quickly, the word lust is, we've heard the word lust for sex. We often hear lust for power. We don't usually hear lust for several different things simultaneously, or if not simultaneously, different channels of passion. So the way we define lust, without getting into the technicalities of it, it is a drive, it is a passion, it is a hunger, it is an appetite. But what distinguishes it from ordinary passions and lusts and the hungers and appetites is that it is insatiable. So there's a great line that Hitler in 1930, that Winston Churchill in 1938 said about Adolf Hitler to a British parliament that was not listening in 1938. But the line about Hitler, which exemplifies lust perfectly as we define it, his appetite grows with eating. In other words, when you lust, the more you get, the more power, the more money, the more sex, the more legacy and legitimacy, the more of it you get. Instead of being satisfied, the more of it you want. And that is, it turns out, a trait or a characteristic that distinguishes some of the great, and I use the word great, pro and con. There's no value, no positive value judgment as I use the word great. That distinguishes great leaders, often distinguishes great leaders from those who are less great. Lusting turns out to be a factor that separates ordinary leaders from extraordinary leaders.
And when you use the word extraordinary, it's meant, it's an indicator or a signifier of their impact, repercussions, fame. It can be good or bad, but it's basically
Exactly.
Okay.
I think, Thomas, just to make one thing about me clear, as you said earlier, I am an iconoclast in many different ways in this field. And one of the ways I am is that I in distinction to most of my colleagues, am as interested in bad leadership as I am in good leadership. I've been as interested in bad leadership for many years. I've written another book about bad leadership. And when I say bad, I mean from a little bit bad, like ineffective or incompetent, to all the way bad, to evil, to evil leaders, or leaders who do psychological harm, physical harm to their followers. That phenomenon interests me every bit as much as does the good leader. In particular, our unableness, our incapacity to get rid of bad leaders, whether at the top of a country or an institution or in the workplace. If you Google bad bosses, you will see how many people, I think the verb suffer is not too strong, suffer under bad leaders and managers, but find themselves unable to address the various issues.
Let's stay a little bit with the book, and what are the case studies or the examples that you discuss as leaders who last, and also what are the famous cases of leaders who don't last, who are kind of last less, or non-illustrious last less leaders, if the alliteration is.
I don't mean to imply that lust is a prerequisite for outstanding leadership. That is not what I'm saying. So, for example, a very well-known 21st century leader who will, I think, go down in history as one of the great leaders of our time is a woman by the name of Angela Merkel, who has been Chancellor of Germany for about a decade and a half. And you can say many things about her, but you cannot say about her that she's a leader who lusts. Quite the opposite. She never intended. She trained as a scientist, not as a politician. She kind of slid into politics and ended up Chancellor of Germany for many years, and excellent in almost every way. So not every wonderful, terrific, great, outstanding, extraordinary leader lusts. However, as implied, many of them do. So, for example, in the chapter on power, we talk about a case that seems to me to be self-evident, which is Xi Jinping. Interesting to watch his trajectory, because when he first came to power in China in 2012, 2013, he was somewhat autocratic and he liked power for sure. But if you watch him over the last 7 years or so, you will see that his lust for power, like Hitler's appetite, seems to be growing with eating. The more he gets, now most recently and most strikingly Hong Kong, but by no means exclusively, just got into a fight with Alibaba's Jack Ma, which Xi almost certainly has won, will win, whatever. In other words, it's not enough for him. Whatever he has, he wants more of. So he's a great example. Roger Ailes is another example. Sex. It's interesting, one of the examples that we use is a man by the name of John Kennedy. You may have heard of him. We, of course, when he was president of the United States, had no idea about any of this. But the decades, I should now say, in the decades that have passed since he died, we understand about him that he was not just a president, and he would not be the first to have a woman in his life who was other than his wife, the very famous Jacqueline Kennedy. He is a president who, in contemporary parlance, would be called a sex addict. That is not a term that was used then. God knows it was not used for presidents, but he is a leader who lusted for sex. People like Tom Brady are in the book, who's he's a leader in the field of football for any non-Americans who are watching, of course. He's playing football in his early to mid 40s, not because he needs any more fame, not because he needs any more money, not because he needs any more adoration, because he wants to be known. He's risking his well-being, including head concussions and whatever, because he insists internally on being known as the greatest football player of all time. He's a leader who lusts. He's not satisfied. He will play until he literally cannot do so anymore. Nelson Mandela, a man named Larry Kramer, who in my view is the greatest leader of the gay and lesbian rights movement in the United States, came into prominence during the period of AIDS in particular. lusted until he died, which he did just this year, to improve the status, the legitimacy of gays and lesbians. And people like Bill and Melinda Gates, it's really a gamut of people. But again, what singles them out is that they will do this. They will have this lust until they die, unless some external force stops them from going ahead.
You remind me of, I think it was Alfred Adler, the psychoanalyst, who said that basically all extraordinary achievers are pathologically insecure, and they need to self-medicate with their achievements for their inner neuroticism and insecurity. So it's that, there is an element of that, I think, in your definition of lust.
I think that's absolutely right. We don't get into, as you're suggesting, Tomas, sort of psychoanalytic suggestions as to what's going on here, but their early lives, as you're implying, are often actually predictors of what, lust doesn't just descend on a 35-year-old. These are people generally who are driven, as your comment implies, from a very early age.
Let me ask you a question about followers and really voters. Is there a sense that the average voter, not just in the US, but in general in the world, and we can just focus even in the free world of Western democracies, if you like, is getting a little bit more savvy and knowledgeable about the quality of potential leaders? Let me tell you where I'm coming at from. I think, when you talk to people, average people, about leaders, there are maybe 2 or 3 leaders like Hitler, Mao, and Stalin that everyone assumes are terrible and bad, and we can all talk about them and, bitch about them, and it's fine. And then maybe at the other extreme, just 2 or 3 like Mandela, Mother Teresa, and then, and everyone else seems to fall in the questionable gray zone of, well, it depends who I'm affiliated with. And no matter what, how much they last, what dark side toxic behaviors they display, or how effective they are not, people seem unconvinced that they should change their mind. So, are we getting a little bit more rational and data driven in our evaluations of leaders if we think about the average voter?
Again, you're going to forgive me for retreating to yes and no. We're definitely, we have more info, we're all on data and information overload. Of course we have more information. However, for various reasons, and I'll just stick with 2, technological we mentioned, but also changes in the culture, we are more closely tied to our ideologies than we have ever been before. So we can get information, and let's say it's very objective information. We filter it through our pre-existing bias with a rigor and vigor that we did not previously. In other words, we're more wed to our positions. Now, let me just make a larger comment. I have observed for years now that in general, particularly in liberal democracies, by the way, every comment I make, Tomas, applies as much to the private sector as to the public one. Where our conversation is a bit more in the public sector, but every syllable, certainly out of my mouth, is applicable to the public sector and to the private sector, not-for-profit, military, across the board. And by the way, these trends are also global. We always make distinctions between autocracies and liberal democracies, but one plays off the other. What's happening in autocracies is a response to what's happening in liberal democracies. So we can never look at leadership and followership in isolation. Oh, this is about the public sector. No, it's at the same moment about the private sector. So my larger comment, if you look at the trajectory of human history, leaders have overall, I know this can sound counterintuitive, but it isn't, trust me, have overall gotten weaker and followers have overall gotten stronger. So your question about how are voters voting, what is the information, what are their passions, it needs to be put in a larger historical framework in which all of us, no matter how oppressed and suppressed, I mean, someone like me, 150 years ago would have had no voice whatsoever. And now I have a voice. I have a voice as a woman. I have a voice with other identities. People have voices who would never have been heard from in the past. So followers, voters, constituents, employees, counterintuitively, they are a noisier, more demanding, less easily satisfied, quicker to anger. It explains why we have street protests in places where we're going, why is there street protest in Chile? That doesn't make any sense at all. It's a rather well-to-do country. Things have been rather good down there. Why are suddenly people in the streets? And for people who've had long grievances, such as African Americans in the United States, you have a few killings of Black people by the police in a short frame of time, and you're going to get the largest turnout, Black Lives Matter protest movements, ever before in American history. So followers generally are more demanding and noisier than they have ever been before in human history. And that is not a trend because of technology and changes in the culture that is going to be reversed. We better get used to it. And leaders who want to lead in the 21st century, now third decade, 21st century, must understand that if they want to be successful in what they do.
This might be one of the more optimistic things I have heard you or seen you say, because you're highlighting that there is progress, and we don't want to admit it or acknowledge it in a way.
There is progress, but a caveat. It makes leadership in liberal democracies. Look at France's Emmanuel Macron. Look at Britain's Boris Johnson. Look at the mountain that Joe Biden will have to climb, mountains. It's not easy. Look at leaders of companies, private sector leaders. They are leaving in greater numbers with shorter tenures than ever before, because leadership is hard. It is optimistic in one way, but in another way, we do need some kind of governance. And when leadership becomes too difficult, when followers are too noisy and too easily dissatisfied, that's not so easy. So there is a cautionary note.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about corporate leaders or leadership in the private sector. And you wrote an earlier book on the leadership development industry and why things weren't going very well there. Have you seen any improvements since, or would you like to summarize your three main reasons and your main points on why things aren't going as good as they could be?
So yes, Thomas, this has not made me the most popular girl on campus. This is a book I wrote in 2018 called Professionalizing Leadership, in which I make what seems to me an extremely basic and simple argument, but it is certainly controversial. So if you want to be a doctor, or you want to be a lawyer, or you want to be a teacher, or you want to be an engineer, or you want to be a truck driver or a hairdresser, you need to go through a learning process. That learning process, whether it's a vocation or a profession, generally consists of three steps. One is education. The second is training. So if you want to be a teacher or a doctor, or as I said, a hairdresser, you're going to want to be a hairdresser, you need to learn a little something about hair. Then you need to be trained in hairdressing. So if you're a doctor, you need to learn about anatomy first. Then you go through some clinical training. And then now in the 21st century, in almost every single profession and every single vocation, you need what we call often continuing education. In other words, you cannot assume that what you learned in 2020 will be applicable in exactly the same way in 2025. So what I point out in professionalizing leadership is that for some reason, leadership is an exception to that rule. I should say the way leadership is learned, both in the public sector and in the private sector, not in the American military. I'll talk about the American experience. The American military is the closest Americans have to teaching leadership right. They do get educated, American military, in leadership. They do get trained, and they do get developed lifelong. By the way, not just officers, but non-commissioned officers. In the academy and in private sector organizations, we somehow assume that if you go away for a weekend, or you take a couple of courses in leadership, or you take some seminars, or you take some programs, you too can learn how to lead. In other words, being a doctor or a lawyer or a hairdresser or a truck driver takes some semblance of coherent curricular learning. Learning how to be a leader requires nothing of the kind. There's no coherent curriculum, there's no credentialing, there's no licensing. You know, what is done at Harvard and the business school is not the same as what is done in the School of Government. It's not necessarily the same as what's done at Stanford or at any other college or university. So what I'm arguing for, as I said, it's not making me the most popular girl in town, but why leadership should be able to be learned quickly and easily, as opposed to the more rigorous professionalizing process that we associate with the professions, escapes me entirely. And by the way, just one more line. The leadership industry, as I call it, is about a half a century old, 40 or 50 years. So that's just grown exponentially. Billions of dollars are spent on teaching people how to lead. At the same time, if you look at the graph of our trust in leaders and our belief in leaders and that they're going to be competent, that has declined precipitously. What's wrong with this picture? One escalates and one de-escalates in equal steep curves. Not good.
Yeah. What would happen if you have employees choose their CEOs and their senior executives, and then a party of experts, including scholars in the subjects, elect heads of states? I guess it sort of happens in China in a way, but I'm interested in the first one. What would happen if people democratically elected those who they think have more potential to lead their business?
Right. So as you know, the founding fathers, meaning the people, the Americans who put together the Constitution, the Declaration, they did not trust the people. The whole electoral college, the crazy, now we think, crazy electoral college system, which is how we elect our presidents, was started because elections were limited. First of all, women certainly couldn't vote, and African Americans. In other words, it was a very limited selection that was permitted to vote. So democracy, we talk about democracy all the time, but in the United States of America, originally it was not incredibly democratic. And one of the, as a counterforce to that, what we have seen, for example, in the state of Georgia, and I mean the American state of Georgia, I don't mean the former Soviet Socialist Republic of Georgia. One of the things we saw in the state of Georgia is how the getting out of the vote, in other words, making Georgia more democratic in that more Georgia citizens were going to vote, is that almost certainly changed the outcome from, in other words, Georgia now is, they opted for Biden and not for Trump. In other words, it became a democratic state for the first time in many years. So there are enormous numbers of good things to be said about everybody having a vote and everybody having a say. On the other hand, let's not make this conversation too simplistic. It depends to some degree. Always we say it depends, it depends, it depends. This depends to some degree on what kind of a leadership role are we talking about. If the leadership role demands a certain level of knowledge and expertise, should it be open to everyone in the building? Not necessarily. So I think rather than coming up with a simplistic formula, all or none, let's look at the context, let's look at who are the leaders, who's up for the position, who are the followers, and then make an informed decision.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Makes sense. So let's talk about your latest book on the pandemic and how America has handled the pandemic, which is coming out in January.
No, I wish. No, it's done,
but
it's going to come out in 2021. I'm at the mercy.
You would have thought there is a certain timeliness that.
No. My publisher is Cambridge University Press, and they have said to me, Barbara, be patient. I'm not very good at that, but I have no choice. So there you go.
Yeah, I have a good quote for you, maybe on patience, which is, professor, former colleague of mine who was very, very impatient, told me that he wanted his epitaph to read, his only problem was that instant gratification couldn't come quick enough. That's a good summary.
Ask your friend if I can steal it.
Yeah,
Excellent.
exactly. Yeah. So let's talk about that book. Obviously, you wrote it, I would assume, in lockdown yourself and while everything was unfolding. So it must have been a slightly different process than all your other books because you were paying a lot of attention to the present and what was going on. But yeah, give us a summary first and what are the main key points?
Yeah, the book, you're right, it was a little different process, but not that much. I tend to write at home anyway. So the points of the book. So as you can tell, Thomas, even from the comments that I've made in this conversation, I do not believe in this obsession we have with the leader. I think Americans, I think the world is fixated on the person at the top, who is very important. This is not to diminish the importance of the leader, but the leader is not the only thing that matters. What matters is everybody around the leader, and what matters also is the situation with which they are faced. So in this case, America has been obsessed for 4 years anyway with Donald Trump. I made that point earlier. It's been really a fixation, a national fixation, for better and worse. By that, I mean those who hate him are fixated, have been fixated, and those who love him have been fixated. Now you look at the pandemic, which struck me pretty early on as likely one of the biggest things to hit the United States and the rest of the world in many years. And I think it will go down in history as an event, even though as we're having this conversation, it looks to be over in the sense of the vaccines came sooner, somewhat sooner than was expected. That's good. But I think our memories on this will be long. We will remember the impact of this pandemic for a long time to come. So I was interested in analyzing it because Trump early on made himself the center of it. And very quickly, certainly by April, May, Americans were starting to rush to judgment. They were making a judgment. If you were pro-Trump, you thought he was doing a great job. If you were against Trump, you thought he was destroying the country. Now, by mid-year, I focused primarily on the first half year of 2020. By mid-year, it became very clear that the United States was doing a less good job of managing the pandemic than were its approximate peers, whether they were in Europe or whether they were in Asia, whether it was Canada. And the numbers now, as we speak, as I said at the end of November, the numbers are fairly awful. The pandemic is raging. So what I looked at in that book is, how did this happen? And I looked at not just the president. In fact, the president is, as I said earlier, kind of at the center, but at the true center are all those who made his presidency possible. And that includes a rabid and fervent base on which the entire Trump presidency, candidacy and presidency has stood since his surprise entry into politics in 2015. It held during the pandemic. It held even with his 72 million votes, the recent election. So that's the base is literally the base, the foundation. But on that base, and I'll give you just a few examples, is virtually every Republican senator who, as we know now, has been more or less mute during all of 2020, and indeed for most of the Trump presidency. On that base stood the rest of the Trump administration, and I could, members of his cabinet, his various advisors, and so forth and so on. On that base stood his family, which is what I call his inner circle, so-called friends, and he doesn't really have close friends, and family. And then if you go more specifically, you will see that there are some key individuals, and I probably named 20 to 30 of them in part 3, the last part of the book. Everybody from his Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, to various cabinet members, to various governors who slavishly followed him. And I end the book with the medical establishment. I know it's controversial to say so, but I'm talking about the head of the CDC, I'm talking about the head of the FDA, I'm talking about people like Dr. Deborah Birx, I'm talking about even someone like Dr. Anthony Fauci. Did someone like Fauci, who as we speak remains revered, respected, revered might be slightly strong, highly respected, did he have a better role to play than what he did in 2020? Can he possibly be satisfied with what happened in 2020, where we are now as we speak? In other words, I look at the cast of characters around Donald Trump and I ask the age-old question. That's really what this book is about. It's specifically about the pandemic, but the question is age-old. When there's a bad leader, what is the responsibility of followers? And if they go along silently and mutely, are they as bad as followers as the leader is bad as a leader?
Mm-hmm. And so is the argument, or would one of the implications be that my desire to look after myself and protect myself health-wise is not as strong or impactful as my partisanship, and because the pandemic or the disease has been politicized and I take sides, somehow people took sides, and because it's the liberal half of the country that is saying, oh, we have to wear a mask, etc., I'm not going to do it, and I don't even care about the potential risk to me. It's basically, that's one of the implications.
It is. I mean, I guess the real question, Thomas, is why. Again, it's specific to the pandemic and to Trump, but it's a larger question. Why do people go along with a leader who demonstrably is incompetent and probably equally demonstrably unethical? What's in it for us? Why did the Republican senators go along? Why did the entire Washington health establishment go along? What is in it for followers who mutely and silently obey a bad leader? Why did the CDC, under Dr. Robert Redfield, who remains the head of the CDC as we speak, become in the last year a tool of Donald Trump? Why did Dr. Redfield permit that to happen? Did he have, I don't mean to single him out, but did someone like him, for example, have other options, such as resigning in protest? Would that have been better? Or do people talk themselves into staying because they can help more on the inside than they could on the outside? So again, the book is very specific, but to repeat myself, I raise in this book, specifically toward the end as the discussion winds down, what I think are some of the naughtiest questions in human history. How is it that we tolerate bad leadership? Why are we so paralyzed by it? How does it come to pass that we suffer, to use a word I used earlier, whether in the workplace or in the community or in the country at large? How does it happen that we are so often strangled, if not literally, of course, but sometimes, but strangled by people who are in positions of authority, whether presidents or managers or superiors in the workplace? Why are we so unable to cope with this? And can the leadership industry, or I should say, could the leadership industry, by teaching more about followership, by raising it to the level of leadership, do more to counteract whatever goes wrong?
Yeah, it's a great question, but isn't the issue and the problem that what's bad for some is good for others, and that we make it a subjective preference, contest, and that perceptions and preferences trump facts, results, realities, KPIs, and outcomes? Isn't that the issue? I mean, clearly, if 72 million people voted for Trump despite the pandemic and the fact that by objective standards, they're probably not better off in most cases, they don't see him as bad. And they probably think the same of Biden. And by the way, all of the people who voted for Biden are pretending that the other 72 million are either stupid, evil or they don't exist. And then we're talking about unifying and bringing us all together. It doesn't seem to happen anytime soon.
Yeah.
Are you optimistic about that?
Well, first of all, I think you were, of course, Thomas, are raising a central question. You know, your good may be my bad. It's as simple as that. And it's an incredibly important question. But there are some, one has to argue that there are some universal verities. There have to be some truths. So genocide is bad. And if you have a leader who is genocidal, that is not a good thing. Do I get, as you point out, that some leaders will go, yay, genocide, wonderful. I hate those people. Let's kill them off. I get it. But unless those of us in the business of leadership find some universal truths, some truths to be across the board, wife beating is bad, genocide is bad, people dying in numbers that are not necessary is bad, what are we going to do? So we have to, in the end, take some kind of a stand. And I agree with you. But again, it's one of those dualities that I mentioned in the beginning. Your point can be correct. Your good is my bad. At the same time, my point, when I said earlier with the point I made at the beginning, holding two things in your head at the same time, you're right. We may disagree on what is good and bad, but I could at the same time be right, meaning that there are some universal truths. So if instead of 250 dead Americans at the end of this year, or 260 or 40, whatever the number is going to be, by December 30th, had we done things somewhat differently, had a somewhat different leader, had a somewhat different CDC, had somewhat different Republican Senate, that number could demonstrably have been cut by 100,000. I'm not saying to zero, I'm saying in some considerable measure. Would that have been better by a standard that I think we can say is universal? I think we need to hold on to that. I think we leadership experts can't throw it all up in the air and say, your good is my bad. We need to come out and say there are some universal truths which we hold to be self-evident. And I would say that fewer dead rather than more dead is one, on account of COVID-19, might be one of them.
Yeah, yeah. I guess, you know, what I was thinking as I spent a lot of the pandemic in Florida, and I wasn't surprised at all that the state went for Trump. You know, if I put myself in the shoes of Cuban, Floridan immigrants, or now Venezuelan owners, I'm optimizing everything for communism is bad. And if someone tells me that someone smells remotely like communism, that's it. I don't care about anything else, right? So yes, I think, you know, people, it's not like they don't have values, but the values at some point are polarizing, and we have a tendency to bucket everything into one end or the other and not see that sometimes they're neither, right?
Again, Thomas, I couldn't agree more with you. By the way, it goes back to the point I made earlier, which is the problem of governing now in a liberal democracy when everybody's got such strong opinions. When, as you point out, Venezuelans and Cubans and other Latin Americans in Florida are more fiercely, they consider this a more fiercely important point. That is, just don't smell of socialism than any other, including public health. And they're very noisy about it. And we encourage that. We want people to feel strongly about their political views. But it is precisely this noisiness on the part of followers, and the fact that your followers may be different from my followers and have different values, that makes, as I said a few minutes ago, governance in a liberal democracy extremely difficult. So yeah, great that everybody's got a voice, but at some point we're going to have to learn to come together, lest governance in a liberal democracy in the third decade of the 21st century becomes difficult to the point of being impossible.
So do you think Biden and Harris can do anything to persuade those 72 million Trump voters in 4 years' time that they did a good job and you know, we're better off? What would need to happen?
Yeah, you know, the numbers of variables, Tomas, I don't mean to shy from your question.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be quite difficult and a considerable, you know, I think most of us would agree, unless, you know, the 72 million, some will be, of course, persuaded that this is a reasonably good presidency. The question is the roughly 35 to 40% that I referred to earlier, that were Trump's base, that just, and some in that percent just loved him. Now, how much of this is specific to the man? How much of it is a broader phenomenon? I'm not sure we know just yet. No question he had a, you know, the word charisma is often thrown around without much meaning. I think in this case, it certainly had some meaning. You know, we could as well, as you're posing the question about the United States, I would throw it back at you about Germany or France or Great Britain or again, Chile or other countries, Canada. In other words, how well our liberal is a president or prime minister of a liberal democracy going to be able to govern as we move ahead? The question, just look at Great Britain, which was torn apart by Brexit. For years now, unnecessary referendum in 2015, called by David Cameron, who never in a million years thought he would lose. Guess what? He lost. Oh my God, I lost, because he wasn't paying any attention to his followers, so he lost. So for the last 5 years, Britain has been torn asunder by this, some of us might consider craziness, that is Brexit. There you go. Again, Macron on paper, excellent, very well credentialed, very smart. He's finding governing France really hard, really hard. Can Biden work magic? I doubt it. Is it going to be okay? Maybe. Is it going to be better? I don't know. Check back with me in I'll give you a guess in 2 years, but dare I guess before he's even inaugurated? No way in hell you're going to get me to do that, Thomas.
Yeah, well, you're on record now, so we'll check in again in 2 or 3 years. And just one last question, and then I will let you go, Barbara. What's your next book going to be on? Have you decided already?
Yes, it's going to be about love.
Oh, wow.
I've written almost 20 books about leadership. I think it's time to do something different. So this one's going to be about love.
Okay, so just love, no leaders, no dark side,
no power, status. No, it could be about power and influence, since love is always a little bit about power and always a lot about influence. But yeah, I've written so many books on leadership. It might be time to try something different. So I gave you an answer you didn't expect.
No, for completely taken by surprise here. Barbara, thank you so much for making the time. I will post a link to your last book and other links so people can find out more about you if they don't know you already. And happy Thanksgiving. And it's a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Thomas. Ditto back at you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.